This is Duke University.
Dan is the author of two incredibly well-regarded books, The Forging of Bureaucratic Autonomy, Networks, Reputations, and Policy Innovation in Executive Agencies, 1862 to 1928, and a much more recent book that he's going to be speaking on today, Reputation and Power, Organizational Image and Pharmaceutical Regulation at FDA. So we're very, very pleased to have Dan with us today, and without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to him.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm just going to use slides here. It's been a very nice, I want to say it's been a very nice stay for me at Duke. I highly recommend the King's Daughters Inn. It's one of these typical things where the university puts its visitors up at probably better places than the university's own people get to stay. Although I won't make any assumptions about where you all get to stay and live. But it's been fantastic, so I greatly appreciate that. So I want to talk about my book, and not purely about what lies in the past, although because the book is already published and I really can't do anything about that. Most of the talk is about what lies in the past, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what goes on in the future in terms of research agendas that I think are of interest to people at universities, and pretty much I would say across the social sciences. Here's a disclaimer: if you want more, oh good, I have one of these. If you want more information, including a bunch of papers, data set, which is now, I think, probably the most comprehensive data set on FDA drug approval, that runs from 1949 up till 2008, I think. Maybe we stopped at 2006, but we're updating it. They can go there as well as some other data sets. Here's the people who funded me. You can view there. So here are some puzzles. So it's commonly said that the FDA regulates not only drug safety, but also kind of how well drugs work. And so when did that happen? The common answer that you'll hear people say is, well, 1962. That's after the thalidomide crisis and everything. Turns out that's not quite right. A better answer, in part, is something that actually happened later in the 1970s called the Drug Efficacy Study Initiative, or Study Implementation, depending on which acronym DESI represents. And I can talk a little bit later about that, but most of it actually would have happened before, and I think it suggests a lot about the way that rulemaking and administrative politics works to sometimes presage the statutes and regulations that we get coming out of Congress later. If you pay attention to the news, particularly the financial news, you'll see very often that drug clinical trials are a really important part of financial reporting on biotech and pharmaceutical companies. So they'll say, well, this important company from the research triangle area just had something pass through phase 2, or it failed in phase 3 or phase 1, right? You might ask, well, where did those concepts, phase 1, phase 2, 3, come from? And why is that sort of a worldwide thing? Is that just science that just agreed upon a platform and a standard? Well, again, it turns out not. It turns out it's an invention of bureaucrats, largely in the FDA in the 1950s, and was anything but inevitable. But it's now come to dominate not only the drug and device industries worldwide, but really the way we think about sequential tests of hypotheses in science. And so this is an example of the government regulatory agency having a huge effect on the concepts and methods of science. You may know that tobacco control policy is now housed primarily at the FDA, despite the fact that we've had a Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and other agencies that have regulated all sorts of things about tobacco. So you might ask, why is that? Is the FDA just the natural place to put it? If so, well, then we have existing regulation at the FDA for a long time. If you study other countries at all, you might be interested to know that Ayurvedic medicines in India, which have been around, since longer than Duke, longer than Harvard, a long time, longer than the Christian religion, actually, about 4,000 years. Well, today they have to meet these standards that they're being produced in India called good manufacturing practices, or GMPs. despite the fact that they've been acceptable in Indian society for, again, around 4,000 years. So why is that? Why did India decide to adopt this U.S. standard? And finally, there's a question that a lot of policymakers and economists have been thinking about for a long time, which is what's the effect of regulation on drug innovation writ large? It turns out that answering that question is actually not easy to do in a causal sense. But once you start thinking about things from the standpoint of the way that this book operates, you begin to, I think, get some more purchase on it, and we can at least come up with, I think, the start of some better answers to this question, including how we might know and untangle some of the difficult and endogenous effects between drug development and regulation in a research design. So all these questions and many more are answered in this book. I wish I could take credit for the picture, and in fact even for the title design. The only thing I chose was that and that. My mother chose that. That is Frances Kelsey. She is the woman who held up thalidomide in the 1960 to 1962, instantly became a sort of a worldwide celebrity. One of the things that the book points out is that she was listed as one of the 10 most admired women of America in 1963. She was behind Jacqueline Kennedy, but she was ahead of Lady Bird Johnson and ahead of Princess Grace. So, and this is a career bureaucrat. And if you read the New York Times, she was recently written up there. And that is Contragon Forte, which is the strong version of thalidomide, which was sold in Germany, and which induced thousands of birth defects. Okay? We'll get more into that in a minute. So my approach to the FDA sort of is the following. And it's not simply an approach to the FDA only. It might actually be somewhat generalizable. In fact, I think it is, to a broader range of government agencies, not necessarily every single possible agency. Let me just start with sort of the notion of reputation and power. The world that we have in pharmaceuticals now basically didn't exist a century ago. And as the worldwide market in pharmaceuticals developed, the United States for the last century was the most profitable market to get into. Not simply because we had a big, strong economy, but because we're also the only one that didn't regulate implicitly or explicitly drugs by price. Now, there's all sorts of regulations that affect prices in the United States, but suffice it to say that compared to other countries, Europe, Japan, Australia, we don't regulate price as much. So if you wanted to make a profit in pharmaceuticals or medical devices in the last half century, sooner or later you probably wanted to be in the American market, right? That lack of regulation of pricing in pharmaceuticals actually, I would argue, strengthened the FDA's gatekeeping power over pharmaceuticals, because the FDA was the one regulator they had to satisfy in order to make that, right? That was really important because it gave the FDA what I call gatekeeping power, well known to political scientists who study sort of gatekeeping powers of committees, even House and Senate legislative majorities and things like that. And it doesn't operate in exactly the same way, but gatekeeping power is at some level kind of an agenda-setting power. What the FDA gets to decide on is not simply whether a drug gets approved or not, but its decisions have a huge influence on the set of drugs that are submitted to it to begin with, because firms are always trying to anticipate its rules and decisions and likely behavior when they're coming up with their own drug submission strategies, right? That gatekeeping power also induces a kind of control over the sets of issues that come before the agency. So if the FDA decides to get a little harsher on, say, weight loss drugs, which it seems to have in the last year, that means actually that there's probably going to be, over the longer run in the future, less development of a certain kind in that weight loss drug, which means that's going to affect the kinds of issues in terms of science and other things that are before the agency. So gatekeeping power is not simply gatekeeping power over the agenda of drugs that the FDA faces. It's also gatekeeping power more implicit over the set of issues that it has to debate. Now that regulatory dominance, I would argue, flowed from a multifaceted reputation. And to make a long story short, the idea is this. If you look at various numbers of indicators of how well trusted federal agencies are in the 20th century, including during the height of government doubt in the late 70s and early 1980s. The FDA somehow still gets these sky-high sort of trust approval ratings from U.S. citizens. I did some more sort of qualitative and narrative studies of what different pharmacologists, scientific panels, other advisory bodies thought of different federal agencies over the course of the 20th century, and the FDA keeps on sort of coming up right at or near the top. Now the important point for my argument is not necessarily that the FDA deserves this reputation. That's a separate question. The reputation could be undeserved. Perhaps Americans' record with drug safety is due simply to a fact of we have a much more vigilant medical profession. Perhaps drug companies really have slowly improved the safety of their medicines. Perhaps, again, one can't entirely rule this out, it has less to do with the FDA than one might think. At the same time, the key is, for my purpose of analysis, is that most of society believes that the FDA is to credit for much of the advances in drug safety that have occurred, especially relative to other countries. Okay? And so the big part of the multifaceted reputation is that there are sort of multiple beliefs and, if you will, multiple audiences. There's this health protection reputation, which comes out of the sulfanilamide scandal and the thalidomide tragedy. Thalidomide was a drug that was manufactured in Europe. It was called, I think, West Germany's babysitter, because it was an antiemetic and sedative that pregnant women often took, but also that kids used to make their kids more docile. Essentially, what was unknown at the time it was marketed is that taken between the 9th and 13th weeks of gestation in pregnancy, it induced a particular set of birth defects called phocomelia, or lack of intermediate limb development. So what you had was kids being born with literally flippers, wrists protruding from shoulders and feet protruding from hips. There weren't any knees, there weren't any elbows. And that was the most common. The number of children born worldwide with phocomelia is estimated at somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000. The number of people, children aborted, stillborn, has never been counted and could be 2 to 3 times as large. Probably actually worth something of a kind of a global history, as well as a statistical history to kind of look into the effects of this on public health worldwide. So why did the FDA have this reputation for health protection? Well, again, that's because this woman single-handedly held up the drug, or at least the reputation is single-handedly held it up. So it never made it onto the U.S. market. And it was a vivid reminder of what sort of pre-market approval regulation, or giving the government a veto power over R&D, can do, at least on the positive side, in the sense that it was a very vivid lesson that in the absence of this woman standing sentry between this drug in the marketplace, it would have made it into the marketplace, and quite possibly the number of children with phocomelia. And I think if you're around 50, 51 today, that's probably around the time that you would have been exposed to this, would have been rather large. We would have had a rather large market. Now there's a big debate, not a big debate, somewhat of a small debate about whether she got lucky, things like that. But the important point from the standpoint of my book is not whether she got it right or got it wrong, it's what everybody believed. And in large measure, our society, our national legislature, our medical professions believe that she and the FDA got it right in this case. And those beliefs induced Congress to endow the FDA with a significant amount of new authority in 1962 in what are called the Kefauver-Harris drug amendments. That officially added efficacy to the list of the FDA, of things that the FDA could regulate about drugs. But it also increased the FDA's reputation for scientific expertise. And then there's this other aspect of reputation that I think needs to be thought of hard in the way that the FDA relates to firms and perhaps even to patient advocacy groups and other sort of organizations in political economy. Any regulator has to kind of have what you might call kind of a bad cop reputation in order to get some things done. Think of a cop on a police corner trying to deter people from certain kinds of behavior. And if you sort of look at the history of the FDA and you talk to FDA regulators, they'll do that. There's this guy at the FDA named Robert Temple. I've talked to him a lot, and you know, when you ask, somebody asks him, I was at a conference once, and somebody asks him, well, how do you make sure that, you know, a company actually does these clinical trials that you really want them to do? And he kind of said, well, because they don't have necessarily any legal authority to command a company to do that. What they do have at the end of the day is the veto power over whether that drug gets on the market. And so Temple's answer to this question that somebody else asked was, well, we talked to them. And just kind of left it at that. And, you know, talking to them in this kind of example could be saying, look, if you don't do this, you're never going to get your drug approved. You know, we're going to be harder on you in other phases of drug development, things like that. The difficulty is, of course, those sorts of regulatory stances can engender lots of complaints by pharmaceutical companies, patient advocacy groups. Before the rise of patient advocacy groups, often organized medical professionals, such as oncologists and others, to say, look, you're not helping patients out because you're keeping drugs off the market or you're not allowing drugs to develop as fast as they could develop due to your regulatory stringency. So there's a kind of a complex balancing act that the FDA, I argue in this book, carries out. There's some drugs, by virtue of reputational logic, that are going to fly through the agency's approval process much more quickly. There's other drugs that won't. And so this reputation depends, it's not simply do people love or hate the FDA, it's which audience loves or hates the FDA. And it's kind of which face does the agency or its different audiences want to show. So there's reputation, and then there's three kinds of power. One is directive power, sort of command and control, what the agency can do to say, look, you need to start turning your purple pills into the yellow pills, because we've determined that you know, the ink you're using, or the dye you're using for your purple pills makes your interferes with the bioavailability of your medicine, the way it sort of is absorbed and excreted and things like that. And the FDA has lots of power to do exactly that, and lots of regulators do. What lots of regulators don't have is gatekeeping power, this ability to say no at the entry to the marketplace. Licensing regulators do, right? Some permitting regulators do, but very few of them have the degree of pre-market entry authority. And then another important argument of the book is that these kinds of powers also feed into another kind of power that I call, for lack of a better word, conceptual power. And that's that the standards and the vocabulary and the statistical methods and scientific methods of the modern pharmaceutical world, including the sort of fundaments of a lot of what you would call the modern clinical trial industry, have been deeply shaped by the FDA. The three-phased system of experiment is one of those. Good manufacturing practices, also invented by the FDA in the 1940s, as I mentioned earlier. Those are now being applied to traditional healing methods in places like India and Sri Lanka. For those of you who study biologics and are interested in biosimilarity, bioavailability and bioequivalence were shaped as much by the FDA as by any agency. Study protocols. And if you work with people in a med school, you might wonder why so many people in med schools use the statistical system SAS as opposed to other packages which have long been available, more commonly nowadays, Stata and things like that. Well, it was the only data set that the FDA would accept for a long time. And so it's not surprising that when I co-author or collaborate with people at Harvard Medical School, I, who use Stata and a tiny bit of R and S+, have to just accept that basically at the end of the day the statistical analysis is going to be done in a program that I don't understand. And that's simply because that's their industry standard, but their industry standard is an industry standard, if you will, because the FDA had a regulatory standard. I think conceptual power is important, and it's kind of hard to always say, all right, well, how do we know that it's being exercised? And I think in a lot of cases, what you have to do is do some very careful historical research and think hard about the counterfactuals that, had the FDA not come up with a particular rule or a particular standard for statistical analysis or something like that, what would have happened in its absence of the FDA expressing its preferences that way? And you can't always get really clean answers to those questions, but I think it's really important because I think the worldwide market in industry, medical industrial complex, if you want to call it, for pharmaceuticals and health products has exploded over the last half century. And these sort of conceptual architectures have a really important influence on what happens in health, but also what happens at universities. So the usual story again is that, about efficacy is, well, there was before thalidomide and after Kelsey, kind of, BC and AD, except this is BT and AK. And, before thalidomide, there wasn't really that much regulation. There was kind of this very loose safety regulation. Phillip Hills has written this book on the FDA in which he says the 1950s were kind of a dark decade. The FDA was kind of in the pocket of business and everything like that, without, frankly, a lot of evidence. And then all of a sudden this happened, namely that, notice, by the way, this child, you can see the toe deformities, but notice also this example of kind of the flippers, the sort of hand protruding from the shoulder here. Thalidomide happened in Europe. It didn't happen here because Kelsey herself held it up. And there is some truth to that story. There's no doubt that we wouldn't have gotten the same kinds of changes that we got in the 1960s had it not been for thalidomide. But one of the things that happens in the 1940s and 1950s in regulation in the United States is I think that the story is a bit more complicated. As early as 1949, in fact, there's some evidence that they were thinking about these concepts in the late 1930s and even early 1940s. FDA officials, and this one is named Irwin Nelson, started giving speeches to pharmaceutical manufacturers and saying, look, you guys are supposed to send us, under the current law, which was 1938, not 1962, evidence that your drug is safe for use as directed, is the way that the regulations went. Well, the problem is, he says, is that, look, safety can't be separated from efficacy, and they would often point to cancer drugs as a phenomenon of that. If you're marketing a drug that has zero toxicity, but also zero effect on a tumor, say a solid tumor, by definition, we're going to regard that as not safe. And the courts accepted that definition. And of course, there was a lot of logic to it, right? And so what they're saying in the 1940s, this is 13 years before 1962, is that your clinical trials, you, the pharmaceutical industry, have to define procedures to be employed in more extensive studies by those who are interested in efficacy. Your reports in your clinical trials will probably include not only observations on freedom toward untoward reactions, namely safety, but also evaluations of efficacy, right? And he's stating what is true largely in the academic pharmacology community, even in the late 1940s and 1950s, which is that people are increasingly interested in answering the question of how does one know whether a drug works. And this is sort of a big, world, global change in the adoption of randomized clinical trials with placebo controls that's happening around this time in the area of pharmacology. And then they come out with a proposed rule, right? This is, again, a set of rules that, if you will, kind of codify or begin to codify these kinds of judgments. And this is from 1956, right? And I'm not going to read this to you. You'll thank me, I hope. But this was literally the kind of form that people would fill out if they wanted to pass a new drug by the FDA. So you would literally photocopy or photostat this page of the Federal Register, fill in whether this was an original drug or a supplemental drug, and then supplemental meaning same molecule but for a different use, basically. And then you'd literally fill this out and then attach paperwork that answered all these questions and about questions that were raised in another 10 pages of type that looked just like this. Right? But the key was this. What this law then allowed or this rule then allowed the FDA to do was to say, look, if you send us an application to market a new drug in interstate commerce, we have the right not to look at it, just not to even, begin to get into the question of whether we're going to say yes or no. Issue what's called a refuse to file, or RTF judgment, unless some certain conditions are met. Whoopsie. And that condition here, I won't go into the detail, but basically what they said was, look, the application may be incomplete unless it includes full reports of adequate tests. I've got to have the first slide here somewhere, sorry. I'm going to screw up. There we go. Full reports of adequate tests by all methods reasonably applicable to show whether or not the drug is safe for use as suggested in the proposed labeling. And then what do those reports have to include? Well, detailed data derived from appropriate animal or other biological experiments, reports of all clinical tests by experts, and then they said qualified by scientific training. So they gave themselves the power to regulate whether or not the doctors testing the drug were in fact qualified. And then here's was the key. They should include detailed information pertaining to each individual treated, including age, sex, conditions treated, dosage, frequency of administration, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, what the FDA was saying is that if you do a bunch of clinical trials, you need not only to show us, your statistical summary tables, you've got to pass us the entire data set. In fact, not only the entire data set, but how you coded things for each and every individual patient in that data set. Right? And allowed the FDA to replicate drug companies' studies roughly about 50 years before any other regulator around the world had the ability to do this, in part because they were getting the disaggregated data from these companies. And then they add this. Results of clinical and laboratory examinations made and a full statement of any adverse effects and therapeutic results observed. So if you didn't say what was the therapeutic result for each and every patient, as well as a summary of each and every patient, they didn't have a basis for turning the drug down by law, but they gave themselves a basis for not filing it, which meant that your drug wasn't going to get marketed. So it was an extension of their veto power by which they gave themselves this power to examine efficacy. So now we're going back here. So what happens? Well, these are approval time distributions for new drugs submitted to the FDA and then approved. And here's 1950 when my data begins. I've got a tiny bit of data from before, but here's when the data really sort of gets much better. Here is 1956 when that most recent notice of federal rulemaking is issued. Here is 1960-61 when they have learned of some of the problems of thalidomide. And here's 1962 when the Kefauver-Harris amendments have been created. So the statutory standard for a drug review in this entire period before 1962 is approximately 6 months. Right? And the median drug was approved during that period in about 2 or 3. Right? But as of the late 1950s, there's a clear upswing, such that by, say, 1959, 1960, we have the median at or exceeding the statutory standard, and the other outer edge of this distribution, namely the third quartile, namely this is the sort of line that tells you that 75% of the drugs submitted in that year get approved in this number of months. This is 90% of the drugs in this year get approved in this set of months. And so the outer tail of that distribution is sort of taking off, right? Now, of course, these are just numbers, and so how can you know this was due to stringency? Well, one of the things I did is controlled in a statistical model for a set of other variables, including what was the workload or the backlog of these applications at the FDA, how many staff did they have? It turns out the number of staff were increasing rather rapidly in the mid-1950s. I don't have any control for how stringent in their brains were FDA bureaucrats. But it's very consistent. If you start looking at some of the drugs that were at this tail, a number of them are being held up because people are asking for more tests. And so it's consistent with this idea that these numbers express some of the logic of efficacy regulation at the FDA 5 to 10 years before they had the statutory authority to engage in efficacy regulation. This is a different way of looking at the data. Remember, in this graph, I'm looking at, well, when does the thing actually get approved? Well, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each drug and decompose it and say, what's the essentially the ratio relative to 1 that this drug gets approved in each, in each month of the review cycle. Do I have that correct? Yes. And so essentially I'm comparing all these numbers to one another. Long story short is, this is the 3rd month of the review cycle, so the 3rd month into a drug review for drugs that were submitted in the period 1950 to 1955. And compared to all other drugs controlling for everything, a drug in that cohort submitted from 1950 to 1955, again about 10 years before the thalidomide crisis, or 5 to 10 years before, has probably 4-fold increase in the probability of getting approved in the 4th month of review relative to all other drugs at that time. All right? So these numbers are sort of the numbers that you are seeing, here, basically, where drugs are getting approved relatively quickly. Once we get to 1956 to 1961, which is drugs that were submitted in the years before the FDA knew that there were problems with thalidomide, or at the very latest, as the FDA was learning with thalidomide, those probabilities of approval basically crash. And you see very low probabilities of approval, particularly in these very early months. And what seems to be going on is that essentially you've got a number of agency scientists who are taking a look at those drugs in the first few months of review and taking a much more skeptical look at how the clinical trials are put together. What's the medical literature on this and related drugs and compounds and things like that. And for that matter, that's exactly what Frances Kelsey did in her review of thalidomide. So the summary here, and this is kind of the historical point, is actually by the time Frances Kelsey began reviewing thalidomide at the FDA, most of the stuff she was doing was in fact pretty well established practice at the FDA. Unlike the stories of Phillip Hills and others, efficacy review and strict procedural scrutiny were already embedded in organizational routines and in fact embedded in federal rulemaking, right? What thalidomide did, I would argue, is not so much to change things, but to legitimize a set of things that were already going on, right? For what it's worth, there's a range of studies in the social sciences, including one by Sam Peltzman, that look at 1962 as kind of a cutoff point for the application of pharmaceutical regulation to the industry. What this statistical exercise suggests is that that exercise has some pretty massive internal validity problems, in part because you can't neatly separate the control, if you will, and treatment groups. A lot of the regulation that Peltzman thinks he's studying after 1962 was in fact there before 1962. Okay? So where do phase 3 trials come from? Well, a similar idea. In the 1940s, you've got all these pharmacologists at the FDA. One of them especially named Arnold Lehman. And they want to understand the following question. There's all these, you ever seen when you look at the food package, FDC yellow number 9 or FDC red number 3? Well, those are food colors that are regulated under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, hence the FDC. What they sort of became concerned about is that, look, there's these new food colors coming about. We want to know something about whether these are toxic to people who are going to be taking them over a 20 to 30 year period. So they come up with a system for 4-phase toxicity testing. If we want to know whether something is toxic, the first thing we want to know is whether, if they touched it, are they going to fall over dead? The second thing we might want to know is kind of, well, if they, have a few samples or something like that, are they going to end up with some problems? But then we want to get to what's called chronic toxicity testing, chronic long-term toxicity testing. Have people and have animals, taking these things for a long period of time. In some cases, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, and then see, let's sacrifice these animals, look at their livers, and all this stuff of kind of classical animal pharmacology, right? That's kind of the first development of sequential toxicity testing. And it's a really, I think, important scientific development, because what people are doing in this world is not simply testing a hypothesis. They're thinking about how do you test a sequence of hypotheses. In other words, the first thing we want to know is there acute toxicity? Is the person going to drop over dead when they take this, right? Once that's been satisfied, what happens to the next hypothesis, and how do you set up that test? Once that's been satisfied, how do you set up the next test? And once that's been satisfied, how do you set up the next test? I would argue that this is a pretty important moment in the development of biomedical sciences and even more largely the statistical sciences in the US and the world, because people are thinking about how to test not simply individual hypotheses, but sequences of hypotheses. Right? The National Cancer Institute is actually also developing this kind of study for what they call phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials in the late 1950s. And at the FDA, none other than Francis Kelsey and some other people at the FDA begin to discuss this. And as it turns out, even though the rules and the phase 3 clinical trial system that we have, or I could argue actually that it's now 5 phases because there's a phase 0 and there's a phase 4, but phase 1, 2, and 3 exist in federal rules as of 1963, but it's actually proposed by the FDA in 1962 before the Kefauver-Harris amendments are passed. So again, you have to imagine, people, a lot of people say, well, look, if thalidomide didn't happen, would we have this sort of highly stringent regulatory regime to govern pharmaceutical development in the United States and around the world? My counterfactual answer to that is probably yes, we would. There would be certain things that wouldn't have happened. The US as a model probably wouldn't have spread around the world as quickly. But the FDA would probably today be regulating efficacy anyway, and they'd probably have phased clinical trials and phased experiments either way. If you look at references to phased clinical studies in the Western medical literature, French, German, Norwegian, a bunch of languages I don't understand, and you look at when they emerge, you don't see the first references, and these are cancer trials, until 1960. And this is the reference for what's called a phase 2 trial. And then you begin to see them increasing right after 1962. So this is an example of where it's not like there's a set of concepts that exist in science that are taken into regulation. It's in fact an architecture from regulation that's imposed upon science, right? And the very nature and structure of science and the clinical trial industry is affected. The other aspect of FDA reputation, I would think, I would argue, is that this sort of tension between sort of good cop and bad cop, and I'm using those terms rather loosely. But I think if you sort of spend a lot of time reading about the FDA, this is something that worries its officials a lot, which is how to maintain this feature of their public and scientific image, including what I would call not simply their reputation for technical expertise, but their reputation for kind of doing the right thing, including showing compassion and flexibility in the face of, say, AIDS patients or terminal cancer patients who may be adversely affected if the FDA cuts off a drug trial or impedes medical progress, while making sure that they're still maintaining a stringent enforcement. And one of the things that comes out of this is what I would call a mode of, if you will, kind of equilibrium ambiguity. A lot of people in the pharmaceutical industry complain that they'll ask the FDA, what do we need to get our drug approved? And the FDA will say very often, well, just do X, Y, and Z and come back to us. But they don't say, if you do X and Y and Z, we will approve your drug. And the FDA is very stringent about avoiding those kinds of commitments or hard if-then statements. Now, you can argue about whether this is good or bad. At some level, this amounts to added uncertainty on the part of those who develop drugs and scientists. At the same time, you could liken it to the problem of what happens, those of you who are professors, what happens when your students come and ask you, Professor Aldrich, what do I need to do to get an A in this class? You might, to optimally incentivize that student, say, well, you should do the following things and we'll see what happens, right? You might not want to say, if you do X, Y, and Z, I then promise you will get an A, right? You might not want to commit to that kind of contract. All right, so one final thing, and then I can begin to open this up. So one aspect of this reputation, I've been largely describing this reputation as, doesn't everybody love the FDA and things like that. And whether or not I do or is irrelevant, what I've been trying to argue is that there's kind of this warm glow reputation that has benefited the agency. But again, there's this other aspect of the agency's reputation that it has to show sort of a formidable face to scientists and drug developers in order to achieve some of its aims. Now, let me give you an example of how that might be applied to address a question that I think has some important policy issues. So there's a claim out there by all sorts of people that essentially what the FDA, one result of what the FDA does with drugs is to limit drug development. Now, one can argue this result, if one believes it, in a number of different ways. One can say, well, there are important therapeutic advances that are not available to us that should be because the FDA has held them up. And or one could say, well, the FDA has in fact had this effect, but now we've been able to separate the wheat from the chaff. We had a sort of a market for lemons earlier where it was difficult to kind of separate good products from bad products, and now we have a screening mechanism that allows us to do that. I'm not going to enter that debate, okay? This may be desirable in the sense that bad therapies are excluded. It may be undesirable. My guess is probably a mix of a little bit of both, and we need to be careful in terms of making claims. The problem is how do we know that FDA regulations deter drugs from being developed? Do we just say, well, let's look at what happened before 1962 and after 1962? That's Sam Peltzman's kind of research design, and a whole bunch of other people have looked at that, and I've argued that that's historically problematic. The problem is, of course, that drug companies abandon drugs in the R&D process for all sorts of reasons, right? Could be that, gee, the mice are turning radioactive when we give them this ED pill or something like that. Probably don't want to develop this any further. It could be that our financing falls through for some exogenous reasons, things like that. And at the end of the day, this is, I think, something that people would know, but I'm pretty sure we are now the first to formalize this. The submission strategies that drug developers include, like whether to go from phase 1 to phase 2 and phase 2 to phase 3, are at some level endogenous to what they expect the FDA to do, right? And at some level endogenous to what they expect paying agencies to do, like formularies, formulary committees for Medicare, Medicaid, things like that. So what we decided to do, and there's a hint of this in the book as well as a paper that we're doing, is to say, look, let's suppose we take a look at negative FDA decisions. FDA says, we're not going to approve your drug, or the FDA advisory panel says, we don't like what we see, or, and this is the killer, the FDA asks for more data, right, which says, we're not going to say no, we're not going to say yes, we're just going to kind of continue this process a little longer. And what we do is then we say, look, what happens to the sort of sponsor's stock price when the FDA asks that question? So if you're Pfizer, right, and the FDA says, seems like a nice drug, I know you wanted it approved today, but let's wait 6 months because we have some concerns about this data. If everybody kind of expected that, then you shouldn't see a lot of movement in Pfizer's stock price the day that decision is announced or the next day. If a lot of people didn't expect it, right, then you should see a pretty big movement in the sense that investors will have taken that as a surprise. So what we do is we take that disturbance, that sort of swing in stock prices, as something that was not anticipable, and from the standpoint of information theory can actually be regarded as something quasi-random, right, in terms of whether or not it was expected. And then what we see is, all right, is that a good predictor of whether companies other than the company that got the bad news abandon their drug projects downstream? And the answer is, it's noisy, but it would seem to be, yes, true. So for every time that one of these bad news things gets delivered, and we've unpacked this a little bit, and it turns out when the FDA asks for more data, that seems to really swing the markets, at least in the last 20 years. Right? For every standard deviation in one of those swings, in the following month, all right? Companies drop 4.5 to 5 drug products, and these are the standard errors on that estimate. All right? Now, what we're doing right now is trying to disentangle this and see whether it's particular to certain kinds of therapeutic areas, and things like that. But notice that at some level what you've got here is a research strategy that you can begin to think about for lots of policy questions. Like if you're concerned about the effects of a certain sorts of policy change on drug development, you might be able to use this kind of research strategy or something like it, something more refined, as a way to think, okay, what is the effect of this going to be on drug development or medical product development in another area? And the other thing that this does, I would argue, is takes advantage of the notion of reputation. What's happening here is that these are companies that were not affected by the bad news. They're other companies, but they're looking downstream at what they think the FDA is going to do in the future, and thus deciding, all right, these 5 drug products are not worth it. Now, can I answer the important policy question of whether this is a good thing or a bad thing? No, I can't. It turns out that's really hard to answer because these are drugs that are often stopped in phase 2 or phase 3 trials before we have good evidence on their efficacy. Probably the best way of getting at that is to see whether they might come out in other markets, whether drugs that have plausible efficacy are also deterred as a result. And whether, I'm not a huge believer in the concept of natural experiments, but there is some internal validity to this exercise in the sense, again, that a day before the bad news was delivered, it's difficult to believe that people would have seen it coming had in fact that stock price shift occurred. Finally, I think it's fair to say that the FDA doesn't have quite the positive reputation that it used to, especially in drug safety. And that swing after Vioxx has been pretty dramatic, probably about a 20-point drop in people rating it good and 20% percentage point increase in percentage of people rating it positively. There's a lot going on here. There's people who believe that the FDA fell asleep at the wheel in Vioxx and other drugs. There's people who believe that the FDA is too closely tied to the pharmaceutical industry, things like that. I don't get into whether the FDA has in fact gotten better or gotten worse. What I'm more interested in is kind of, do these beliefs have an effect, number one, on policymaking? Like if the FDA has this declining reputation, is it then the case that Congress is less likely to give it leeway with respect to the policies that it might want to develop and implement? Might that also be true with the courts? There's an interesting story you can tell about a recent case before the Supreme Court where the FDA's reputation actually hurt the case that the Bush administration was making. And actually, I think one really interesting policy question would be, if people don't trust the FDA and the system as much, does that have therapeutic implications? So a really interesting question right now is, why don't people take their drugs? It's commonly known as the adherence problem in pharmaceuticals. And there's a lot of people beginning to study this. Right? There's some evidence that after drug safety problems have arisen or have been announced in a class, that people are less likely to continue taking drugs that they've been prescribed. I don't know of any way really cleanly to be able to say, is that because they don't trust the pharmaceutical industry, they don't trust the government, things like that, they don't trust the FDA, but I think it's a really interesting policy question, is that are there therapeutic effects or behavioral effects that everyday patients and physicians have if they've lost trust in the ability of the FDA to sort of guarantee a safe and effective drug supply? That's it. I think the only other thing I would say is this confidence effect of regulation, I would argue, I think is an important thing for policymakers to look into in the future. In that if you actually believe that the FDA is an effective screening device, or even partially effective, consumers, in this sense physicians and patients, might well respond to that screening device by actually making switches to newer and innovative drugs more often, because they're less afflicted by the uncertainty that exists in the absence of regulation. Namely, a market for lemons becomes a market with fewer lemons, in the famous words of George Akerlof, because you have the screening device there. If that in fact is a plausible benefit of FDA regulation, and people have claimed it has been, it's not one that people discuss or try to measure in debates over policy at the FDA. That's it. Questions?
I'm really interested in what your fundamental interest, motivation, and hypothesis was when you chose to study this new way of living.
When I chose to study this agency, to be honest, I was a political scientist who kind of thought this agency seems really powerful. Why? And there are kind of two dominant hypotheses out there in the regulation political economy literature. One is kind of capture rent seeking, and one is public interest. Capture or rent seeking, the idea that different interests get what they want. I mean, there's a story that some people have tried to tell whereby, look, the people who really are interested in setting up licensure regimes or market entry regulation are the people who are incumbents in an industry. Why? Because they want to make it more costly for entrants to get in. They want to dilute their competition, right? That story doesn't work here. I sort of go through the different legislation. In fact, the people who would have been long-term beneficiaries of the market exclusions, their representatives routinely vote against FDA strengthening legislation. They routinely lobby against FDA strengthening legislation. So I don't buy that as a reason for why that occurs. I was really interested in, the other thing was looking at some old polls and trying to, which agencies did people trust, and just seeing this incredible variation. And specifically the FDA is one of the top kind of vote getters in that respect. I think you need to be careful inferring a lot from surveys, but it began to sort of launch me on a puzzle as to sort of, why might, all government agencies have this problem, right? Do its clients trust it? Do legislators trust it? Do people regard what they say as credible? The Fed has been going through this for a long time on monetary policy, consumer policy, things like that. All sorts of regulatory agencies have issues with credibility. And by issues, I don't mean necessarily problems that they all have low credibility. It's just a dynamic that they all struggle with. So I thought there was also something potentially generalizable here that social scientists ought to examine. Is that?
I should probably, for your sake, it's always good to know who's asking the questions or
Sure.
for the background so you can understand where I'm coming from. I'm in the science world,
Okay.
and my father was a pharmacist and graduated in 1938 from pharmacy school, so I know the whole history. I lived through it. I was a pharmacist before I was a physician. I've lived through this whole development, watched it happen, and I'm integrally part of that system, I suppose. And I'm chair of the Drug Safety and Risk Management Advisory Committee for FDA, so I'm an SGE for that.
Oh, great.
Soon to reach the time of that. So I am based in science, but I'm struggling. I certainly understood everything you were saying, but I was struggling for the simplicity of how you refer to people love or hate the FDA is in question, or what audience loves or hates the FDA, sort of this dichotomous, it's this or it's that, and a willingness to not even get into what's fundamentally a reasonable criticism, or opinion is opinion, and it doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong. And my personal perspective is that they have the hardest job in the history of the world. I mean, they literally can't win. They either approve it quickly so that you have every new innovation, or they, and you then have safety problems, or they do what Francis Kelsey did, and sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong.
Yeah, sure.
So this sort of quick wave to, well, it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong, and I mean, I have serious things I bring up to you that I would challenge that you said, but it's because I'm steeped in what's true or valid or not valid about this.
So
I can answer all your questions without reading your book about, well, why might GMP standards be required for a drug that's been around forever? Well, I can answer that question from a scientific standpoint. Probably to everybody's like, oh, well, gee, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'd be interested, we can talk about GMP and Ayurvedic later. So let me just say, it's not that I don't think the answer to whether people's views are right or whether the FDA is wrong or right is irrelevant. and not that it doesn't matter. But if you want to focus on whether public trust matters, right? Whether credibility matters or whether reputation matters, you have to, at least for analytic purposes, set some of those issues aside, at least for a moment, to focus on reputation and power, right? Now, the criticism that I've been, I haven't said enough bad or good things about the FDA is one that you may have known that Marcia Angel made of my book in the New York Review of Books a couple months ago, and we had a little spat.
Did she argue you weren't critical enough?
Yeah, she basically, well, there have been a bunch of reviews, and most of them have been really nice and lovely, and then there were a couple that were less nice, and that's inevitable. Hers was kind of odd in the sense that, well, everything here is kind of right, but, it's not opinionated enough. And, I'm not being quite fair to her, but that's 80% fair. And I do think it's really important to kind of set aside the, just for analytic purposes, some of the questions about is or is not this the right policy or scientific decision, and think about how a democracy operates, because at some level this book is about how a democracy operates. It's about whether people believe in those things. Now, I would say as well that even if you think you're making the right scientific decision, say at the FDA, it's going to be really, really important, even if you have arrived at the right scientific decision, for lots of other people to, number one, believe that you made the right scientific decision. And no scientist should be confident that just because they think they've made the right one, it has all the validity aspects that the public is going to, right? I think that's naivete. And second, that regulatory officials are aware of their various political constituencies. So you might say, okay, look, we're going to be hard because on this cancer drug because we think that it has some safety issues, right? But if being hard on that cancer drug means that you've got, say, the breast cancer lobby lining up against you, threatening your appropriations or threatening your rulemaking ability for a whole bunch of other things that you care about, well, if you're a politically savvy agency and you care about the long run or the wider world, you might approach that particular cancer drug decision with some degree of caution, precisely because you care about the wider reputational politics of that. And it's one way of viewing what the FDA has done in a lot of cancer therapies. The final thing I'll say is on things like, you're right, there's a scientific basis for applying things like GMPs to Ayurvedic medicines. But there's all sorts of manufacturing standards that the Indian government or its state regulatory agencies could have used. The fact that they used the GMPs was just to say, well, let's look out there for a legitimate standard and adopt it. Right? There's a scientific basis for a lot of things that world companies and things have done. But that only narrows the variation a little bit. You have to understand, at the end of the day, you have to be able to answer why among 5 or 50 different scientific standards did world governments, including these state regulatory agencies in India, consistently choose the FDA standards again and again and again. John, sorry, he's a political scientist.
Go ahead, John.
The question I wanted to ask is sort of sparked off by that, which is, so the FDA adopts a set of standards like the 3 trials. It's not like, I presume it's not like they're just sort of autonomously out there in the world and said, we should think about this, let's make this about a nothing. Right? So it could very well be the case, and it wouldn't be unique to the FDA, that they basically wrote down what had become sort of standard practice, indeed even among sort of scientific review and that sort of thing. So I wonder how autonomous are they really, and how unique are those standards?
Yeah, and to be honest, I mean, I'm overstating it and overly bluntly stating it in this talk. What you're describing, in fact, did go on. There was a set of networks among academic pharmacologists that was university-based. In some companies, Merck in particular, had hired a bunch of these people. Although it's fair to say that in the mid-20th century FDA, you probably had the largest collection of pharmacological talent anywhere in the world, let's say 1950. literally just the numbers. They just had far more than anybody else did. And a lot of people were beginning to think about these sequential hypothesis tests precisely because people were taking things for 20 years. You know, it wasn't just the world of penicillin anymore or antibiotics. It was, you know, an antidiuretic. It was a heart drug. It was, you know, all these sorts of things that people would be taking for years and years and years. So you started to care more about what was happening 5 years down the road. So the one thing I would say is I should, you know, be a little careful in terms of over projecting from the talk. I don't want to say, I am clear about this in the book, although the book is 800 pages, so you might not find it. But you know, I'm not saying that the FDA invented these terms. What I am saying is that in the absence of the FDA, or in the presence of a much different FDA, these terms would have turned out or much different from the way they did. So, for instance, there was a lot of discussion about what about just 2 phases, right? So would we have gotten phases? Yes, probably. There was actually a discussion about having 4, right? So, and 3 was not the compromise between 2 and 4. But I mean, this is an excellent question, and it gets into questions of essentially the history of science and the history of experiment. There's a long chapter 3 in the book that talks about these linkages, and so I want to be very careful. This is not my first book. I'm not saying this was an example of autonomy, although there's a little sniff of that. It's more of the sort of networks that linked universities, companies, especially universities, and the FDA, with which these came about. And I didn't even mention the National Cancer Institute, which was really crucial. The whole idea of like coming up with a protocol for testing a drug, that was immensely shaped by the NCI, because they started these oncology groups in the 1950s. So, so it's more complicated than does that?
Hi, I'm Jonathan Weiner from Duke Law School.
Okay.
And a couple of questions. One was when you're trying to estimate the impact of FDA's decisions on abandonment of drugs by other companies, or other measures of the reputational, or however you're describing the broader effects of FDA decisions on not just the drug being reviewed, but on other market behavior. I'm just curious what you're controlling for there, or what other variables you have. And this occurred to me also when you were speaking earlier about people believing that FDA is very effective. That is, for example, do you have measures of tort liability activity? And there are other regulatory institutions that also, in effect, review and sanction side effects of drugs, and in particular, tort liability. And so it might be that some of the impact being attributed to FDA review is actually occurring because of prospect of tort liability, and that may not be constant over time. So when at the end you showed FDA's lower reputation scores in the recent poll, it'd be interesting to see that over the whole 50-year period, and and interacting potentially with the role of tort lawyers in publicizing cases. You mentioned Vioxx, for example, or many other cases. But so that's one question about sort of historically disentangling the effect of FDA versus the effect of other institutions such as tort law. My other question was, I take your point about it's difficult to assess whether FDA's decisions have a net beneficial effect on public health because you don't know what the other drugs would have. They were earlier in the pipeline of clinical trials, so you don't know what their ultimate impact would have been. But have you or other people looked at broader measures of public health? That is, if you look at FDA over the course of 50 years for many, many different drugs, you might think that if FDA is doing a good job compared to similar agencies in other countries, that you'd be able to measure some aggregate impact over time. Has anybody, maybe you or other people, trying to do that?
We're actually interested in that a little bit. Let me deal with your first question first, which is on this question. You're absolutely right. It would be great to have like a nice time series of how people evaluate the FDA. The problem is this particular set of questions With that kind of wording only goes back a few years. There's some data point that a lot of FDA folks throw around that like they had 80% approval ratings in the 1970s or something like that. I can't seem to find a really reliable estimate for that. I don't doubt that they were much higher because there are ones from the early 1980s that are in the, high 60s to low 70s. But it's over long. And I agree that I wouldn't necessarily interpret causal force to Vioxx here. I mean, the fall off is pretty steep. But in addition to sort of wider societal factors going on, there was also this Plan B decision that happened where the FDA refused to approve an over-the-counter morning after pill contraceptive that was widely seen as kind of kowtowing to politics and things like that. And there's probably a wide variety. So whether or not first off, this could be picking up not just simply this part of the question, the FDA, but do we think drugs are safe? So you're right, so that could be declining for that reason. And it could be, affecting, a fair number of, it could be picking up a fair number of things. So this is simply kind of exemplary data. Now on this question, I think I'm a little bit, I do control for some other things about what determines drug development over time and what factors predict. But the idea between this is, is that at least this particular variable shouldn't be correlated with those things. And why is that? Well, the idea is that what I've done is to say, okay, the FDA delivers bad news on a single day, right? I look at the change in the company's stock price the next day, nowhere else, right? I then benchmark that by how the market as a whole moved. And there's other ways of benchmarking it, right? You don't have to be a believer in kind of, perfect markets theory or, purely rational expectations. There's a number of other ways of getting to this result, but most people would regard that shift in stock prices, that surprise, as essentially unanticipable from the point of information theory one day before or even 1 month before. And the reason, the logic is this: if it wasn't unanticipable, somebody would have made a hell of a lot of money betting on it, right? So if that's true, and you can do some checks on that, essentially the independent variable behind this shouldn't be correlated with anything. Now, you can run different tests and things like that, but the internal validity criterion here, I think, is reasonably legitimate. Yes, you should probably control for some other things, but at the end of the day, you're not too worried because this behaves as if quasi-random.
Could I ask a question about this,
Yeah, sure.
to follow on from what was just asked?
Yeah.
In terms of other factors.
I want to get to your other questions.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
In terms of other factors, one of the things that was most striking to me about this description, I remember a time when the cost of drugs per se was a very, very small percentage of the medical dollar.
Yeah.
And the kind of effect that you described in terms of the FDA made a decision not to approve something where the stock dropped is so tightly correlated with the development of consolidation in the pharmaceutical industry and the need for blockbuster drugs and quick approval, maximize market, the whole trend is the biggest driver of this. Not that FDA itself suddenly with its power has suddenly changed the world. It's that if companies are driven by primarily profit, and if profits are tied to speed and having a blockbuster, yet this is 100% predictable. I mean, that fact
so the relationship is predictable, yes, but
press,
the relationship is predictable, or at least one can come up with a sort of a rationale for it. But the surprise that happens the day after or the day of one of these announcements is not predictable.
No, the surprise though, it may be a surprise to the stock market non-scientists, but it may be just uncovering a real fundamental scientific flaw in the safety of this product.
I agree.
Or in the assumption of effectiveness of this product, which God protect FDA for protecting us against.
Sure. No, these
I
are not
just-
necessarily the wrong decisions, right? I'm not, yeah, that's not the,
But
the
the way
point
it's sort
here.
of conveyed as, power, and therefore these bad things happen, it's sort of, there's a tone of, you could potentially, I know Marcia Angel took the other point of view, but you could potentially yourself influence the perception of the FDA just by the tone of voice and what you say and what you choose to
Yeah,
emphasize.
I think there's so many people out there trying to do that I'm not worried about my own impact. I mean, I'm a political scientist, so power to me is kind of just another variable that we look at, to try to analyze. I don't think it's necessarily bad or necessarily good. Depends on what's done with it, what sorts of institutions are set up to structure it, things like that. Governments have power, corporations have power.
So the biggest thing,
Universities have power.
the biggest thing is that instead of it being that we have an agenda set by finding treatments for grievous disease that are not adequately treated, we have this sort of thing where people are seeking the biggest market, and that's what drives our research. So there are
Well, yeah,
fundamental issues.
that's a more complicated
Yeah.
question. I can't.
Gotcha.
No, that's okay. Your second question, so you had the question about controlling for things, and I'm sorry.
My second question was whether you could assess the net public health impact
Oh,
of
yeah,
FDA
yeah.
decisions by looking at a larger data set.
So here's one thing, so you could potentially. So here's one thing that hasn't been done. So there's this big literature on what was called the drug lag. And this was the claim, some of it quite true, that the FDA's approval rates for new therapeutics was behind that of, say, particularly European agencies, and particularly Great Britain in the 1970s. Some other people have kind of disentangled some of that data and found the big differences between the US and the UK. And then the question is as well, with these drugs that mattered, and what people pointed, the most common example that people pointed to is a very common argument about out of the Cato Institute was beta blockers. That the FDA was slow in particular to approve, I think, Inderall as a beta blocker. I think that was a supplemental approval in the United States, and it ran about eight years behind. And there's one estimate that cost us like 12,000 lives. Well, the difficulty is that estimate, what that estimate did is it took a clinical trial estimate about how effective beta blockers were relative to placebo, right? And then extrapolated it to the 8 years that beta blockers supposedly weren't on the United States market and were on the UK market. Right? What nobody has done is actually compared to see whether people who might have benefited from beta blockers had different or differentiable therapeutic experiences in the UK versus the US over that period of time. That's the kind of evidence that one would want, say in the case of beta blockers, to know. The other interesting thing, I mean, I think it's a really interesting, wide open question, is there's now evidence that once you compare beta blockers to, I believe it's oral antidiabetics and antidiuretic drugs, I if I have one of those wrong, which by the way had been around before beta blockers, there's not evidence of superior efficacy. And this is, large-scale randomized comparative clinical trials. So it's not clear that beta blockers were, compared to the drugs that already existed on the market, kind of the, wunderkinds that some people have made them out to be. I think that's essentially, sooner or later, the kind of evidence that we need, which is to say, all right, if one country is getting more stringent on a set of drugs, not taking drug availability per se as evidence of welfare, which is what Peltzman did, but looking at differential health outcomes in those areas. Now, there's some cross-country evidence that suggests, this by an economist named Frank Lichtenberg, that suggests that more new drugs being released on the market are correlated downstream with superior health outcomes. The problem is those comparisons are being made using really disaggregated data. There's a lot of critics also of his studies and things like that. And the real important thing is to look, I think, drug by drug or drug class by drug class at the particular kinds of diseases afflicted by the drug in question whose approval times vary across countries. And I should be very clear that Lichtenberg himself does not examine regulatory-induced changes in drug availability across countries. He just counts up the number of new therapies across countries, which is kind of a problem in this literature. It's sort of too wedded to what's called the Poisson model of innovation, where you just kind of count the number of new products and use that as kind of an index of innovation as opposed to more refined measures, which at some level would probably include health outcomes.
Hi, I'm Erin O'Reilly with the Regulatory Affairs Group here at the Medical Center. And I was just wondering, on your slides, your times to approval, did you look for differences after the after the Modernization Act?
Oh, yeah, I've done some work on that separately. Did the user fee acts have an influence on approval times?
She's asking about the
No, I'm asking if that evened out approval times.
Oh, well, I don't know whether it did across countries. That's a good question. Actually, approval times have been increasing in the EU. That's in response to his question. But there's pretty good evidence that, there's good predictive evidence, not great causal evidence, that the user fee acts reduced drug approval times. Exactly. The problem is they're coming in. They're coming online at the same time that, say, the use of computers in the federal government is exploding. So there's a lot of factors to disentangle. But there's no doubt as a predictive factor that these user fee acts have generally resulted in, or generally been associated with quicker approval times for approved medicines. There's some concern that what the FDA has done is transfer its stringency from the approval criteria to the clinical trial stage. So being hemmed in more by these user fees and deadlines at the drug approval time, what they do is they exact more stringent requirements in testing.
So at your end of phase 2 meeting, you find out.
Right.
And it delays your application.
But there's, again, nobody's really come up with a good test of that hypothesis. I think there's some anecdotal evidence for it, and I wouldn't be surprised if it were true in some cases. Exactly what contribution it's made to the increased cost of drug development, I think is kind of hard to get at. But does that address the thing?
I was just didn't remember how far this went out.
Oh yeah, sorry, no, this is old. This stops at 64. 3 years before I was born. Old data. So.
Well, Dan, I'm being interested in hearing you talk a little bit about the implications of this general method of analysis for thinking about regulatory dynamics in other settings. So you mentioned the Fed a little bit earlier. I'd be curious whether you might think about some of the implications of just the general approach and the general findings of the study for other regulatory contexts.
Yeah. Well, from the standpoint of social science, I think, what this does is, I think it gives us another purchase on why some regulators have power. And power in a very diverse sense that I'm talking about it here, or where political scientists might be more interested in kind of when do agencies get delegated authority from Congress, or when do they have more leeway from the courts, or things like that. And I'm not saying reputation is the end-all be-all answer to that, but I think it's a part of it. There's a big literature in the political science, political economy world on delegation, and when does Congress and when do elected officials decide to say turn over this policy to an elected bureaucracy. And a lot of it has to do with expertise and different preferences and things like that. But at the end of the day, I also think that a really crucial feature of that dynamic is what does the legislature, what do elected authorities, and what do voters think about the vessel in which politicians are placing authority. I think that's going to be a pretty important determinant. The other thing I think is to the extent that we're interested in understanding how regulators behave, predicting where regulatory policy is going to go, I think reputation, again, it's not the only theory that you can use, but I'd like to think it's one that people would want to keep in their arsenal. The way I put it, I think, in the book is the primary concept here is one of audience, and you can think of that as constituency in a way. But it's different from purely like, distributed politics or the money goes here, the money goes there. When AIDS activists were making a big stink about the FDA's procedures in the 1980s, they didn't exactly have a lot of, money or political clout behind them. They certainly didn't have any good alliances in the late 80s, very early 90s with pharmaceutical companies. What they did have was the ability to embarrass the FDA and make it look inflexible, non-compassionate. And so, did the FDA in part change policy due to the fact that AIDS was this public health crisis? Absolutely, part of it is science. But the particular way they changed a lot of their policies, I think, has a lot to do with them trying to sort of display flexibility to a particular audience. And now there are plenty of those audiences. Some of them more commonly funded by drug companies and some of them less so. But it gives you a sort of a set of factors that you need to take into account when you're trying to analyze agency behavior. And I think the other thing I would really kind of focus on here, I was talking about financial regulation. We just created this new Consumer Financial Protection Agency. To what extent does the effect of these policies depend upon what consumers and others believe about them, and what citizens believe about them? And I think that's a research agenda that we really don't know much about yet, either in political science or economics or history and things like that. Do we have good sense of people, whether they kind of trust products in a certain kind of market? I think we're going to be facing that with consumer loans and mortgages and credit cards for a long time. And is there a role for regulation, or maybe not, in increasing kind of institutional or market-wide confidence in the distribution of products that we all face, as opposed to, say, one product versus another. And I think that I think is a really, really important research agenda, and I don't think it should, I think political scientists should be tackling it in part because it depends on what, not simply people as consumers believe, but what people as citizens believe about the trustworthiness of the political process and of regulatory processes. So it's my hope that our fellow political scientists and historians and economists and everybody else, that political scientists should exclude themselves from this agenda, because I think it's really important. At some level, there's been some, like, do people trust government? But I think at some level, we're asking a much more specific and meaningful question. Do they trust a set of institutions to do things? And then is their behavior affected? So you start looking at things like, maybe do we see the effects of institutional distrust in sort of, the market for consumer loans? Do we see the effects of institutional trust or distrust in whether people take their drugs or not? Right? That kind of thing. And I think at some level, those might seem like narrow policy questions, but I think in some very large and really important sense, those are questions of democratic politics.
Two thoughts about what you were just saying. One of the fundamental implications about this level of public trust that I see in my world is the diminishment of interest of the participants to participate in clinical research as part of this process, which is an interesting phenomenon. But in particular, I was thinking that you might be interested in, you may have heard of it, but there's a kind of new initiative that FDA has recently started, driven a lot by Commissioner Hamburg, which is a focus on regulatory science. And given that a lot of the reputational things you discussed throughout your talk are issues of, do they have better science? Did they derive the science? Were they, leading the curve? The interesting thing about what she's been articulating, and I think where they're moving, is trying to engage independent, perhaps academic institutions and other institutions outside of the agency to strengthen the science behind the decisions they make, realizing they can't have enough employees and enough expertise to do everything themselves. So that would be an interesting thing to watch relative to what you proposed here.
Yeah, I agree, actually. If you look at those data that suggest there's this decline in confidence about the FDA, I think the current commissioners get that in a way that some of the previous commissioners don't. You see people like Lester Crawford saying, trust us, we've got this right. And even von Eschenbach to some degree. Hamburg and Sharfstein are much more likely to go to the Hill and say, actually, this is a problem we can't get solved, or we're not yet equipped to solve. And part of it is, I think, at least from an academic standpoint, a kind of welcome circumspection about, what an organization can accomplish. But they also realize that they're probably better off admitting their limits rather than sort of stating a clear hypothesis or conclusion and then having it being undermined by other. The other thing is, you're absolutely right, a lot of what you would consider regulatory capacity, this gets back to John's question, is in part capacity that's in other organizations, including third-party organizations like universities and scientific societies. And the book talks about how the FDA was, part of its reputation was literally not just what did people believe, but building networks to all those things. And that's one way actually of viewing the FDA's advisory committee system, which sounds like you serve on, and which is far more developed than almost any other agency's advisory committee system. You can view advisory committee systems as, well, we want the advice of other people. You can also view advisory systems as, we want a way of legitimating our decisions and connecting us to people whose judgments we care about, right? And you don't have to believe anything sinister or even a co-optation hypothesis to believe in part that's what works. There's an interesting article in the recent Journal of Politics by my colleague Susan Moffat on FDA advisory committees and examining the way that they might work in this way. It sheds some light, I think, interesting light on that hypothesis. But the building of capacity at some level is not just what's in the agency versus what's outside. At some level, the FDA has kind of gotten that for the better part of 5 or 6 decades, that they had to build all these ties to other fields. But you're absolutely right that they're doing even more of that under a handbook. So.
Well, Dan, thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.